Time for fondant, my favorite part of decorating a cake. And you want to know how I do it? You're about to find out. For this cake, which is a 9-inch round cake, I'm using 2.5 pounds of fondant. The first thing you need to do when working with fondant is to knead it really well. You want to get out all the air bubbles. You want to sort of soften it. If you live in a hot climate and you find that your fondant is getting sticky while you knead it, you can put a little bit of vegetable shortening on your hands. If your fondant is sticking to your surface while kneading, you can just use a bit of icing sugar sprinkled onto your surface and knead that into your fondant as you go to stop that from happening. Fondant is simply a sugar dough, mainly made up of different types of sugar, and it's used to cover cakes. It's great on novelty cakes. You just roll it out and cover a cake and smooth it on, as opposed to icing a cake with a palette knife. When you're happy with your kneading, what I like to do is save myself a bit of work by bringing all the seams down underneath your ball of fondant and then flattening out your fondant just to help you roll it out better. So now what we're going to do is put down a nice layer of icing sugar. And don't worry, because we can scrape away and brush away the excess. Now place your fondant down onto your icing sugar. I like to put a little bit of icing sugar on the surface of my fondant, just a light sprinkling, and then I actually sort of brush most of it away, just because I don't want it to stick to my rolling pin. I like to use a regular rolling pin to roll out fondant. And what I like to do is try and roll in every direction at first. So back and forth, side to side, and then diagonally, just so we can maintain that round circle of fondant as we're rolling. You do have to press in order to roll it down, but I try to go a little bit gently just to keep it nice and even. I don't want to push all the fondant out to the edge and have some parts be thinner and some be thicker. Try to maintain an even roll. And as you roll, you might notice air bubbles. Like this baby. Use a pin, a nice little sharp pin, and just insert it on an angle slowly into the fondant, into the air bubble, and then use your hand to brush the air out of that hole, direct the air out of that little pinhole. Now keep rolling your fondant, and at this point what I like to do is start to roll from the center out. This is a great time to scrape away any of the excess icing sugar you have under your fondant. I use a plastic scraper, and what you do is you just push it out. Just like that. I can tell that my fondant circle isn't big enough just by looking at it. It has to be large enough to cover the top as well as all around the sides of the cake, because we're gonna pick up this whole piece of fondant and drape it over the cake. So keep rolling. I like to roll my fondant 1/8 of an inch thick. That does take some practice at first, so every single time just try to get it a little bit thinner than the time before. This is what I call game time. Cake time. I call this cake time. So you want to work quickly when you're picking up your fondant. This is very important. It is heavy, it can slip, it can rip, it can drop, it can crack. A lot of things can go wrong at this point, and you don't want that to happen. I like to pick up my fondant with a French rolling pin, which, unlike this rolling pin, doesn't spin. You can pick up fondant with this. The problem is it's heavy, so when you pick it up, your fondant might just roll right off, and you don't. I learned that the hard way too. I'm gonna save you the trouble. So just rest your French rolling pin in the middle of your circle, fold it over. This is a good time, if there's too much icing sugar, just brush it away, because that will sort of stop your fondant from sticking to your cake. Pick it up. Be very careful when you do this. Okay, now working quickly, drape this fondant over your cake. You want to get to the corners first. That's the most important. Glue them down just with this part of your hand. Work down the sides of your fondant. You're going to get folds where the fondant sort of overlaps, and what you want to do is stretch them out and use the palm of your hand to just lightly press it against your cake. So when you get to a fold, you sort of pull the fold apart, make it flat, and then work it toward your cake. And you're also sort of pressing down so that the excess fondant is moving away from your cake, and you're also moving any air bubbles trapped under down and away from your cake. I just like to cut away any excess fondant just because it's getting in the way. Now It's time for a fondant smoother. What I like to do is work from the top outer edge and smooth inward. That's what I like to do. You will usually have an air bubble on the top of your cake. Once again, use your trusty pin and just insert it into the air bubble and move the air out of the hole. And there you go. Now you're going to use your fondant smoother to smooth out the sides of the cake. I like to start at the top, and you want to just press the flat surface onto your fondant, pressing it into your cake, and then I like to sort of move down. This way, if there's air, I'm pushing it down once again. And when you're at the bottom, the base of the cake, you really sort of want to not only press into the cake, but press down onto your cake board. Now what I want to do is sharpen up the edges of this cake just a bit. So what I'm going to do is use 2 fondant smoothers. What I like to do is place one on top of my cake that sort of pushes the fondant outward and gives me a nice sort of sealing. And then the second fondant smoother will work up toward the top fondant smoother. So I'm starting to see sharper edges on my cake, and really what I'm doing is using this smoother as a sealing and pulling this smoother up with the fondant to meet the other one. And you also want to take your fondant smoother and go back around. Because we've been using a flat surface up and down, we might have created some ridges. So you want to smooth those out, working with the shape of the cake. There is a lot of air at this crease. A good way to handle that rather than a pin is to just lift from the bottom and release that air down. So once our fondant is nice and smooth and you're happy, the next step is to cut away the excess. You should see a nice clean line down at the base of your cake. And before you cut away the excess, keep in mind that fondant has elasticity, so sometimes it bounces back after you cut it. So what I like to do is take my fingertips and actually push this excess fondant into the cake before I cut it. Now I'm gonna cut away the excess fondant. I'm gonna use a very sharp paring knife. So you wanna cut right on that clean line, as close to the cake as possible. Cut slowly and cut mainly with the point of the sharp knife. Now just pull away all your excess fondant. This cake is as smooth as I can get it for now. What I'm going to do is put it in my fridge to chill for 30 minutes. It is true that the fridge makes fondant sweat. I have a special fridge that has been altered not to do that. Here's a tip for you guys if you have a regular fridge. What I used to do was empty a space in my fridge and turn it down to the lowest setting possible. And I would only put my cake in there for about 10 minutes. If that's not an option for you at all, just set your cake aside so that the fondant can firm up a little bit, at least on the surface. My cake is covered in fondant, it's slightly chilled. I'm gonna show you how to cover up these unsightly creases if you should have any. This is just royal icing, which I usually have on hand. Just take a little bit of royal icing on a small offset palette knife and then just smooth it out. There we go, my crease is all patched up. Now I can move on to decorating.